Hi folks, I'm going to deliver a few remarks about the measurement of health disparities for Dr. Cooksey's class, and it's going to be a little bit about measurement, then health disparities, then race, ethnicity measurement, racism too, all of them with relevance to the United States cultural context primarily. Before we go into serious topics, I wanted to bring this up because this is a relevant topic for your age and actually across the lifetime span, which is how do we define something like love or romantic love? And one besides this question, which is common in measurement or in general in defining a new construct or a known construct and then trying to assess it or evaluate it or measure it. The first step is, how does it appear? Where does it come from? Does it grow from something else, pre-existent kind of condition? When do we really know it's present? And this applies to anything, diseases too in medicine. What are the signs of its decline? When does it start disappearing? When is it not there anymore? And what does it become when it disappears? So these are questions that many folks are asking, not just in social science research, in health research. So you can ask yourself about this. I added here a lot of context from one study in particular. If you go to the slides, which are online, you can use the QR code or the tiny URL at the beginning. There is a research increasing love feelings, marital satisfaction, but they talk about this decline issue over time. So when something exists and then it declines, actually they come up with something interesting, which is, can it be brought back up? Love upregulation, they call it. And they have a number of measures in there that are very interesting. Attachment scales or attachment measures are common in psychology, social psychology. And this is an interesting term that I didn't know very well in English, but I had to learn about it. But it's an interesting one, infatuation. And they also had some, in this particular research, some physiological measures, ERP, electroencephalogram. But in that article, actually, they have some visuals, which is pretty interesting. And these are the more useful ones. I think it's the same article. And this is how males and females, so in this case, this is a male-female relationship setup. How do we form perceptions of the other? And my question here was about the B and the C link, how females perceive males, how males perceive females, whether the two processes are completely different or very similar. But it's interesting. And in the end, there's two more steps that they added, from self to all the way an outcome of in relationships, which is satisfaction with relationship. But it also goes through this ideal partner added layer here, because the perceptions seem to be influenced by something in between here. There are some interesting pathways to look at here, in particular S and L here. To what extent someone's ideal partner actually influences their satisfaction, more so than or less so than how they perceive the other one. But there are some other interesting concepts, and I just listed a few of them because most of them are difficult to measure. If you go to any of these, you can actually click on the links and find some interesting articles or books about this. I'm not going to read the first quote, but the second one is very interesting to me. It says that fictional objects, like characters in a novel, Mrs. Gamp is a character in a novel, Charles Dickens, Martin Chuzzlewit. But fictional objects may exist even though they are not real. However, fictional objects imaginary friends clearly do not exist. That's what some philosophers are saying. And I'm saying this in the context of measuring constructs like equity, happiness, which are very clear in plain English, but they are actually very difficult to measure. More so concepts like mindfulness, imaginations, things that happen in the brain but point to something else which is hard to measure. In practice, we measure things with numbers, and we believe those numbers are pretty clear. Income and age are pretty clear numbers, like age in chronological years, it's pretty simple. Income seems to be simple. However, this is a quote from J. Kaufman's paper. There seemed to be really an exchange rate apparent in income when you compare black and white residents in the United States, literally meaning that the same dollar is worth 20 cents for black residents. And also in age, there is a distinction now between biological and chronological age, and I'll show you how biological age is measured. But also some other interesting concepts like pain, which is a very simple one, are notoriously very difficult to assess because only the person knows the actual level of pain. It's a very subjective measure. But this was something else I wanted to point. You can go back when you look at the slides. In general, uncertainty and ambiguity is all over the place, and it has a place in psychology research, medical research. Dealing with uncertainty, tolerance of uncertainty is an interesting concept, or tolerance of ambiguity. It has an impact on this kind of relationship, perception of the other, and reducing uncertainty in communication in general, in interactions. And nowadays AI is one of this other that we're interacting with, and there's a lot of uncertainty management in that kind of interaction. They are very interesting measures. Just a quick review of these two concepts that you will be seeing all over the place, or you've seen already: reliability and validity, or accuracy and precision. Some folks use it. This is the ideal. We hit the target in the middle, and all of our shots hit the same target, and not here. We consistently hit the same spot, but it's wrong. So there is a difference between these two. You can click on the link and see more details. Some interesting quotes that you can also take home and think about. They come from Dave Kenny's work, and he's talking about accuracy and bias, and it looks like it is possible to be accurate by being biased. That's a statement that I don't get, but it's interesting. You can go back to the research. It's not listed here, and although we do not find that people are accurate, we do find that they are accurate perhaps because they are biased. So I think he said it a couple of times. But the terms bias and accuracy in his research, which is social psychology, are slightly different. We're going to come back to this bias, to the implicit bias measure, quickly. The chronological age example I gave you, besides age in actual, this is chronological age in years, biological age may actually mean something else, and it might be a combination of many biological indicators of aging differently. And this is a quote from this piece. At a specific chronological age, black residents are approximately 3 years older biologically than white. So again, at the same chronological age. Measures can be implemented in two main simple ways, and some of them are called scales, others are called indices. This is a little too much detail for you, but there is a difference. We usually look at measures on the right hand side, which is scales, and I'm going to give you a few examples. This is an example from one of my mentors who's been looking at discrimination, primarily in gender discrimination in hiring. And there have been some court cases in this on this topic. And what he is saying, and actually this is a defense of many employers. Employers make the case that men are more qualified than women. That's why more men are hired as a percent of applicants. And in fact, when you account for qualification in this manner as an indirect effect, if there is any discrimination left as a direct effect, then that is properly called discrimination. So it may be explained away if you enter qualification in the process. There's another example that's famous, which is instead of qualification you can add department, and here acceptance into college, because this is an interesting similar case. Fewer females overall are accepted into college, it seems, but when you look at within departments, there seem to be more females actually, which is an interesting paradox. An intuitive way to look at health disparities, we're moving into that quickly now, is just to show some lines like these. So one of them is for one group, one population, African Americans, and this is the life course. This is years on the horizontal, and on the vertical there is some health outcome. And white populations, the white populations seem to enjoy higher levels consistently across the entire lifespan. So the difference between these two at any time point or life time point is going bigger, smaller, is growing, is shrinking. So it's just an intuitive model. There are some other intuitive models, but beyond that, when we look at differences between races and ethnicities in the US, that's the phrase we usually use. We have to start with what does race mean, and then we can look into racism constructs and definitions and measures. And race, of course, you are talking about this in your class. It's a social construct. It has a long history. There are many definitions, but I wanted to show this just briefly because when we talk about the other, and in this case it's someone of a different race or ethnicity as mine, this table, which is a very complicated one, but it's actually making sense from David Kenny, a social relations model, is showing to what extent perceptions are consistent or not. We perceive everyone of a different race the same, or everyone perceives me the same or us the same. And there's many concepts of accuracy and bias that are relevant here: similarity, reciprocity, accuracy, uniqueness, very interesting ones. Again, it's a little specialized, but it makes sense. I can walk you through this if you're interested more, or you can ask questions later. There are some definitions from 2 health affairs articles that I'm including in here, and you can read them and you can make sense of them. The point of showing both of them is that they both articles have structural racism and systemic racism definitions, and they appeared in the same issue actually. They are not very similar. Structural racism may seem to refer to policies, practices, norms that create differences, and racism is characterized by, so you can read this. Again, the point is that the second article is defining them slightly different. Structural and systemic together, there's a definition, and then they split them. And there is mention of institutional racism here. It goes pretty, it grows complicated in the definition of phase, but then in the measurement phase, we can talk about measuring racism in different ways. This example is about experiences of racism or racist incidents or racism in the community, and this is a very general 3 questions listed here. People are judged by the color of their skin, here meaning in our community, or they are not, they don't worry about racist insults, which is reverse coded, and they don't they don't fear police harassment, which they might, so this is reverse coded too. But it can be in real life, in day-to-day experiences, daily contexts, on a bus. This is examples from another study. I just gave it here because it's an interesting measurement approach, the ecological momentary assessment, which is pretty much trying to scan what happens in real time. But we start looking into who's the target, or who experiences racism, who is actually enforcing it or creating it. And here we can talk about individual people or structures. A structure is a very interesting term. It has a long history in sociology, and we cannot define it very clearly now quickly. It's just some definitions for you to look at. But I want to show some direct definitions that have a more visual, geographical, spatial meaning, which is something I'm doing recently. So this one, for instance, which they call multidimensional racism measure, it combines a few differences or ratios between black and white indicators, difference in education, employment, income. So all of these are differences. So when you combine them, you get a bigger difference, or an average of those. There are other ways to measure them. Other folks have used different kind of ingredients, but it's the same logic, the proportion of blacks to whites, and there's measures of poverty, by the way. We can use a percent of black residents in poverty versus white residents in poverty, and so on. So they are interesting approaches. But in general, conceptually, structural racism can be operationalized, meaning where we can start to measure the concept this way. And these are some of the ingredients. Now we call them discrimination or inequity, inequality, measures or differences. But one good example of such a measure that I've seen, and there aren't that many, is this one, which literally tested the measurement structure of what they called structural racism, and it has a bunch of indicators, all of them again black to white differences or ratios. There are many mechanisms of health disparities or racial disparities, but one particular interesting measure which you may have looked at is this implicit bias measure, which is very interesting, but there are other ones: oppression, discrimination, microaggressions, very interesting ones. In this implicit racial implicit bias, there's now a big data set across the whole United States, which is very interesting. One of the authors here, Payne, has contributed to creating that one. So they did this, they measured this implicit association test or implicit bias in 2007, 2016, just to see if it changed. I was just looking for Connecticut. Connecticut seems to be high both years, so it's pretty out there. The highest seems to be New Hampshire, sorry. This is just a simple example to show how health disparities are operationalized in the end, or how they are reported, which is this many people die, this many more black residents die, but when we account for social economic status, a little fewer died more than white residents. So there is still a health disparity here in terms of mortality, I think. Burden of disease, no, not mortality, but there is differences in mortality too, and this is a famous finding. So black men seem to have the highest mortality due to cardiac problems, and you can look at the other groups. There's differences by gender. There's many ways to compare someone to someone else, or a group to another group. It gets very complicated what dissimilarity means, or Gini coefficient measures income inequality. Actually, it's a very famous one. This is a more relevant view of differences. This is incarceration, and this is a known kind of number. It's about 4 times higher, the rate of incarceration among black residents than white. And there are some other measures. There has been documented differences in mortality due to COVID by race ethnic groups, which is pretty well known. Mortality differences by racial ethnic groups, black versus white in this case, again seems to be a consistent finding somewhat. When they controlled for a bunch of variables, the difference actually disappeared in this case. When this number is higher than 1, there is still a difference, but it's not anymore, which is interesting. And just some visuals to show you the geographic distribution of differences. This is states where slavery was legal and it was outlawed. Let me see where no, it's not. Well, it was, but then racial discrimination was outlawed in 1964. It's about the same states, and you're gonna see the same colors. This is life expectancy, which is lower than the national average, and this is life expectancy, which is higher than the national average. And you see it kind of follows the same trend, and you can analyze such relationships, spatial correlations, and there are some other ones, some other examples, but there's also Connecticut examples that I have. I can give you more data. So some conclusions: health disparities are somewhat simple numbers like this versus that, but there is more behind this kind of difference numbers, and the final numbers can not be final, because you can add other factors and they may disappear or dance around. So you may miss health disparities when they are real, or create some artificially, or we can increase or shrink them by hand. So if you have questions, just send them through the Husky CT chat. We're going to figure out how to do it. Thank you.